Delaware.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for up to 15 minutes, and that Senator Young be recognized to speak after that for up to 5 minutes prior to the scheduled vote.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that the privileges of the floor be granted to following guest member of our staff, my staff, Kelly Powers, during the pendency of today, July 25th, 2024, and signed Thomas R. Carper. That would be me, and I would like to send this up to you, Mr. President.
Without objection.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Mr. President, good morning. Last month, as some of us will require, marked the 80th year since President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill, into law. 80 years. In the 8 decades since the GI Bill was enacted, it has helped millions of veterans, including myself, to pursue an education, to become homeowners, and to live the full American dream. The GI Bill truly transformed not only our economy, but a lot more than that. I was glad to recently lead a bipartisan resolution recognizing the importance of this legislation with Senators Jerry Moran, Senator John Tester, and Senator John Bozeman. As I've shared here many times before, the GI Bill is often called the greatest legislation ever enacted in the history of the United States, including here in this chamber. First, the GI Bill successfully enabled millions of service members, including myself, to transition back to civilian life after serving our country at home and, in many cases, abroad. Second, it uplifted millions of American families and it reinvigorated our economy. Third, it allowed for benefit awards to our veterans to be passed on to their family members. And fourth, it has paved the way for subsequent critical legislation that serves those who served our country in times of war and times of peace. The effects of all 4 of these achievements are felt to this day. And I'd like to take a few minutes, if I may, at this time to elaborate on the impact of each of those 4. First and foremost, the GI Bill helped my parents' generation return to civilian life following World War II. This generation was well acquainted with hard times. Many of these folks had been raised during the previous World War and were just starting to rebuild their lives when the Great Depression ravaged the American economy, leaving 1 of every 4 Americans jobless. But despite hardship at home, these brave Americans answered the call to serve our nation in World War II. And one of those brave Americans was my father. My father had been a Chief Petty Officer in the Navy, high school graduate, West Virginia coal mining town. And he and his brother and his brothers-in-law all served in World War II. Several of them as Chief Petty Officers in the Navy, others as sergeants in the Army or Marine Corps. But when the war was over, my dad came back to West Virginia and used the GI Bill to learn how to fix wrecked cars. Most people don't think of the GI Bill as something used to fix wrecked cars, but he did. And that turned into a job for him at a place in Beckley, West Virginia, coal mining town, where he fixed wrecked cars at Burleson Oldsmobile. And one day he was working in Burleson Oldsmobile, having learned how to fix wrecked cars and do body work through the GI Bill. He was visited by a claims adjuster from Nationwide Insurance. And the Nationwide, it turned out, had insured the car, that wrecked car that my dad was working on that day at Burleson Oldsmobile. And the fellow from Burleson Oldsmobile, the fellow from Nationwide Insurance, engaged my father in a conversation about how was the progress coming along in terms of repairing the wrecked car. And they talked for a bit. And at the end of the conversation, the fellow from Nationwide said to my dad, he said, you seem to have a lot on the ball for guys. You're fixing wrecked cars here at Burleson Oldsmobile. And my dad went on to explain how He'd been a chief petty officer in the Navy. For those of you who know the military, the top non-commissioned officer in the Navy is the chief petty officer. That's what my dad was, and several of my uncles as well. That conversation with the claims adjuster for Nationwide Insurance that day actually led to a job where my dad became a claims adjuster for Nationwide Insurance. And years later, my dad helped to run the national training program for claims adjusters for Nationwide Insurance. A guy with a high school degree who had a chance to serve in World War II and to benefit from the GI Bill, to have a great career and to be able to provide for his family, along with literally hundreds of thousands of other veterans. But my dad is just one example of millions of Americans that this legislation helped to set on a path to success. But my dad also illustrates the second reason why the GI Bill is among the greatest pieces of legislation ever passed, and that is it lifted up millions of hard-working Americans and helped build the middle class as we know it in this country today. With a stroke of a pen, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed into law one of America's most ambitious investments in our workforce and our nation's history, and it paid dividends. It has paid dividends for decades to come, generations past and future. Among other things, the original GI Bill provided a college education to add, listen to this, 450,000 engineers, 240,000 accountants, 238,000 teachers, 122,000 dentists, 91,000 scientists, 67,000 doctors, and one or two folks who could fix wrecked cars at places like Burleson Oldsmobile in Beckley, West Virginia. Just like my dad, countless others used their GI Bill benefits to learn a trade or to learn a skill, enable them to lift themselves and their families up firmly into the middle class. It was clear then, as it is now, that the GI Bill is perhaps one of the most worthwhile economic investments in our nation's history. According to a 1988 report from the Joint Economic Committee, it was estimated that for every dollar that the United States has invested in our veterans through the GI Bill over the years, roughly $7 has been returned in economic growth for our nation. Almost never do we see legislation have the power to single-handedly transform our economy and continue to do so, not just for a couple of years, but for decades. The GI Bill exceeded and continues to exceed all expectations. As many of my colleagues know, I've personally benefited from the opportunities provided by the GI Bill. I would not be standing here today in this place, speaking on this floor, without the benefits provided me as a Vietnam veteran coming back from my third tour in Southeast Asia, eventually moving to Delaware and enrolling in business school at the University of Delaware. And that education, along with my time as a Navy ROTC midshipman at Ohio State earlier in time, has enabled me to serve Delaware as their treasurer, as their congressman, at-large congressman, as their governor, and now for the last 23 years as their United States senator. Third reason why the GI Bill is truly extraordinary is that this legislation and subsequent legislation like the current post-9/11 GI Bill allows for benefits to be passed on to family members of veterans who do not use or need the benefit themselves. My generation, when we came back from Southeast Asia and the Vietnam War, if we took advantage of the GI Bill, that was fine, I did. But if we had a spouse, our spouse could not take advantage. If we had children, dependent children, they could not take advantage of the GI Bill. That's all changed. And for a GI who doesn't use the GI Bill benefit today, if they have a spouse, their spouse can use it. If the spouse doesn't use it, they have children, their children can use the GI Bill. What a benefit for not just the GI, but also for the spouse and the family members. Today's GI Bill allows countless veterans across our country to take advantage of these generous educational benefits or pass them down to their families. Moreover, the post-9/11 GI Bill includes a program called the FRY Scholarship, FRY spelled F-R-Y, scholarship that ensures surviving spouses and children of fallen service members have access to hard-earned benefits of their family member who served and made the ultimate sacrifice for our country. We've seen the impact of this legislation firsthand in my home state of Delaware with families like those of the late Staff Sergeant Christopher Slutman, Marine veteran. A native Delawarean, Staff Sergeant Slutman bravely served as a New York firefighter and as a U.S. Marine in Afghanistan. However, 5 years ago, he was tragically killed in combat, leaving behind his wife and their 3 daughters, McKenna, Kenley, and Wesley. And thanks to the post-9/11 GI Bill, which extended the benefits of the GI Bill to veterans who served after September 11, 2001, Staff Sergeant Slutman was entitled to a wide range of educational benefits. And after his tragic passing, Staff Sergeant Slutman's GI Bill benefits were ultimately allowed to be passed down to his 3 daughters, thanks to the Fry Scholarship, which was one of the provisions I was proud to support in the post-9/11 GI Bill. Last but certainly not least, the GI Bill is among the greatest legislation ever enacted because it has served as an excellent model for how we can continue to provide resources for our nation's veterans. Throughout my years in the Senate, and there's been quite a few years, almost 24, I've worked to advance critical legislation that delivers on the promise to serve those who have served our nation. In addition to the post-9/11 GI Bill and the forever GI Bill, I was proud to lead passage of a bipartisan amendment that finally closed something called the 90-10 loophole. For those who may not know, this loophole allowed bad actors in the for-profit college sector to take advantage of our veterans' hard-earned GI benefits. One veteran misled or mistreated is one too many, and I was proud that my Senate colleagues and I came together unanimously to pass the amendment that Senator Moran and I authored to close this loophole, and we did. We must also be on guard to root out the bad actors who try to take advantage of our veterans. That's why just this week I co-hosted our annual Veteran Summit in Delaware with Senator Chris Coons, Representative Blunt Rochester, joined by our Secretary of the VA, Dennis McDonough, to raise awareness of the deceptive marketing tactic deployed by those we know as claims sharks. Claim sharks are unaccredited lawyers and consultants who try to take advantage of vulnerable veterans by offering to help them file claims with the Veterans Benefit Administration and then go on to take a significant percentage of the benefit that the veteran should have received. At our summit a week ago, we spoke with dozens of veterans about the free resources provided them, available to them through the VA to help them avoid falling for scams and ensure that they know about the full range of benefits they are entitled to. And more recently, I co-sponsored bipartisan legislation to impose penalties on these sharks so that we can further protect our veterans. After all, our commitment to care for our veterans, including safeguarding their hard-earned benefits, is a sacred obligation and one that I worked hard with many of our colleagues, Democrat and Republican, to fulfill. In closing, it's clear that without the foundation of the original GI Bill, our ambition to craft and pass generations of subsequent legislation to help our veterans might not have been possible. And for all these reasons, the lasting legacy of the GI Bill leaves no doubt that it's truly the greatest legislation ever passed in this chamber and in this Congress in the history of our nation. For my family and me, to the veterans of today in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and all of our branches, I'm honored to lead this celebration of the 80th anniversary of the original GI Bill. Here's to another 80 years, and hopefully many beyond that. I'll close with one thing. There's I used to think it was in the Bible, Mr. President, that if you give a person a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a person to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. As it turns out, that's not in the Bible. It's not in the scripture. For years I said it was. And finally, you used that line in a speech back in Delaware. I said at the end of my speech that talking about how our obligation is trying to make sure that people have the ability to feed themselves and their families. And as it turned out, there's a preacher in the audience when I said those words. He spoke to me after my speech and after the program was over. And he said, those words are not in the scripture. Those words are not in the scripture. The idea that we have an obligation to help teach a person to fish and so they can feed themselves and their families and all. He said, that's really not in the Bible. And I said, well, it ought to be. It ought to be. We do have we have an obligation to help people, not just to give people something, but if they're hungry, they need help, we have an obligation to help them. But the real obligation we have is to make sure that ultimately they can help themselves, that we can help themselves. And one of the great things about the GI Bill is it enables our service men and women to help themselves as they go forward in the future with their lives and to help their families. It's a great piece of legislation, and we celebrate it here today for the 80th year since its original enactment in this chamber. And with that, Mr. President, I'm going to yield the floor. Thanks so much.